The cry in the night. Stan Holloway had always believed in minding his own business. That was the way things worked in neighborhoods like his, small, quiet streets where everyone knew each other just enough to wave from their driveways, but not enough to pry into one another's lives. It was a peaceful existence, predictable and unremarkable, and Stan was perfectly content with that. At 61, he had long since settled into his ways. He worked at the local hardware store, took pride in his front lawn, and enjoyed a simple evening routine. Come home, heat up dinner, watch something mindless on television, and fall asleep in his recliner. Nothing ever disrupted that rhythm, until the night he found the girl. It was an early autumn evening, the kind where the air had just begun to bite with the promise of colder days ahead. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long golden shadows across the pavement. The wind rustled dry leaves down the sidewalk as Stan stepped out of his car, slinging his lunch bag over his shoulder and fishing for his keys. That was when he heard it. A faint, broken sound. A child's sob. Stan froze, his hand gripping his keys tightly. He turned his head slowly, scanning the dimly lit street. At first, he saw nothing but the ordinary suburban quiet. Then, under the dull glow of a street lamp at the far end of the block, he spotted a small, lone figure. A child. She was pacing in uneven, nervous strides, pausing every few seconds to glance over her shoulder, as if she expected someone to jump out of the shadows. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, her shoulders trembling. Stan hesitated. He wasn't the type to interfere in other people's affairs. But something about the girl's posture, the way she shivered in the cold with only a thin jacket to protect her, sent a prickle of unease up his spine. Instinct won out over hesitation. He took a few careful steps toward her. "Hey there," he called softly, keeping his voice low so as not to startle her. "You okay?" The girl stopped dead in her tracks, her head snapping up. In the dim glow of the streetlight, he could see her face, pale, streaked with tears, her eyes wide with fear. Stan recognized her immediately. Her name was Lily. She lived a few houses down with her father. He had only ever seen her in passing, playing in the yard or walking home from school. She was about 10, maybe 11, with dark hair and a small, slender frame that now looked impossibly fragile. Lily didn't answer him at first. Instead, she took a half-step backward, as if preparing to run. Stan held up his hands in a placating gesture. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said gently. "I don't mean to scare you. I just want to make sure you're all right." Lily swallowed hard, her breath hitching in her throat, her fingers clenched into fists at her sides. I can't go home," she whispered. Stan's chest tightened. "Why not?" he asked carefully. She hesitated, her gaze darting down the street. Then, in a voice so small he barely heard it, she said 3 words that changed everything. "He'll kill me." Stan felt his stomach drop. His first instinct was denial. Maybe she was exaggerating. Maybe she was just upset over something trivial. But looking into her tear-filled eyes, he saw something undeniable. Raw, unfiltered terror. His pulse quickened. "Who, Lily?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his gut. "Who are you afraid of?" Lily's lips trembled. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, the sound of a car engine rumbled from down the street. Immediately, she stiffened, her entire body going rigid. Stan followed her gaze. A black sedan was rolling slowly down the road, its headlights off, gliding eerily through the darkness. Lily let out a small, panicked gasp. Without thinking, Stan stepped in front of her, shielding her small frame with his own. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he watched the car. It drove past without stopping, but as it passed under the streetlight, Stan caught a glimpse of the driver's face. A man, dark hair, sharp features, and a pair of cold, watchful eyes that met Stan's for a brief second before the car turned the corner and disappeared into the night. Lily's breath came in quick, panicked gasps. Stan turned to her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "Lily," he said firmly, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Was that him?" She gave a tiny nod, her whole body shaking. That was all the confirmation he needed. "Come on," he said, wrapping his coat around her small shoulders. "You're coming with me." She hesitated only for a moment before nodding. Stan led her back toward his house, his mind racing. This wasn't just a case of a lost child or a simple family argument. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. And he had just stepped into the middle of it. The shadows of fear. Stan guided Lily carefully up the short steps to his porch, unlocking the door as quickly as he could while glancing over his shoulder. His hands were steady, but his mind was a hurricane of thoughts. Who was that man in the car? Was he looking for Lily? And more importantly, what had happened inside that house to make a little girl whisper those terrifying words? "He'll kill me." As soon as they stepped inside, Stan flicked on the living room light. The warm glow cast soft shadows on the wooden floors, making the space feel safe, secure, at least for now. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, Lily seemed to collapse in on herself, her knees buckling slightly as though the weight of her fear had finally caught up with her. Stan caught her before she could fall, gently guiding her to the couch. "Here, sit down," he said, grabbing the thick knitted throw from the armrest and wrapping it around her trembling shoulders. "You're safe here, okay?" Lily clutched the blanket tightly, but didn't answer. She was still shaking, her fingers gripping the fabric as if it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. Stan could see the exhaustion in her face. Whatever had happened, whatever had driven her to run, it had drained her completely. He moved to the kitchen, filling a glass of water and bringing it back to her. "Drink," he urged softly. "It'll help." She took it with shaking hands, sipping carefully as if afraid she might spill it. Stan sat in the armchair across from her, resting his elbows on his knees, watching her carefully. "Lily," he began after a long pause, choosing his words carefully. "I need you to tell me what's going on. Why can't you go home?" She lowered the glass, her fingers wrapping tightly around the rim as if she was considering whether she could trust him. Her wide eyes flickered toward the window, as though she expected to see the black sedan parked outside, waiting. Stan followed her gaze and felt the unease tighten in his chest. "No one is coming," he reassured her. "It's just us here. No one is going to hurt you, but I need to know what's wrong so I can help you." She swallowed hard, setting the glass down on the coffee table with a quiet clink. "He's dangerous," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "And he did something bad." Stan's breath caught in his throat, but he kept his face calm. He needed her to keep talking. "Who?" Lily looked at him then, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "My dad." Stan had suspected as much, but hearing her say it made it real. He had seen the man before, of course. Lily's father, Daniel Brooks. He was a quiet, no-nonsense type, the kind of man who never lingered to chat when neighbors were outside. Stan had seen him a handful of times, usually getting into his car or pulling into the driveway, but the man had never been particularly friendly. Stan had chalked it up to personality rather than anything sinister. Now he wasn't so sure. Lily's small fingers twisted the hem of the blanket, her lips pressing into a tight, pale line. "I think he hurt her," she whispered finally. Stan's blood ran cold. "Hurt who?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. Lily's voice wavered. "My mom." Stan inhaled sharply, his heart pounding. He had noticed that he hadn't seen Lily's mother in quite some time, but he had simply assumed she had left or was just keeping to herself. He had never imagined something darker lurking beneath the surface of that house. "What do you mean?" He pressed gently. "When did you last see her?" Lily shook her head, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know. It was a long time ago. One day she was there, and the next, she wasn't." Her voice cracked. "Dad told me she left us, that she didn't want to be a mom anymore. But I don't believe him." She clenched her fists, her whole body rigid. "She wouldn't leave me." Stan's heart clenched at the pain in her voice. He gets mad when I ask about her, she continued, her voice dropping even lower. He tells me to forget about her, that she's never coming back. And then he gets angry. Stan's jaw tightened. Has he hurt you, Lily? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she shifted in her seat, wrapping her arms around herself as if she could physically shield herself from the memories. He hits me when he's mad, she admitted finally. Not all the time, just when I make him angry. But it's getting worse. Last time, I thought he was going to. She broke off, shaking her head violently, as if she couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence. Stan exhaled slowly, trying to keep his own emotions in check. He wanted to march down the street and confront that man himself, but that wouldn't help Lily. We need to call someone, he said carefully. The police, child services, someone who can make sure you're safe. Lily's head snapped up in panic. No, she cried, gripping the blanket tightly. If they come, he'll find out, I told. He'll come after me. Her voice trailed off, her breathing shallow and quick. Stan leaned forward, his tone firm but gentle. Lily, listen to me. You don't have to be afraid anymore. He can't hurt you if we do this the right way. You're safe here. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't respond. A heavy silence stretched between them before Stan finally stood. I'm going to make a call, he said, reaching for the phone on the side table. Lily watched him with wide, fearful eyes, but didn't stop him. Stan dialed the only person he could think of who might know what to do. Miss Carter, the local school counselor. She had worked with troubled kids before, and if anyone knew the right steps to take, it was her. The phone rang twice before a warm but serious voice answered. This is Miss Carter. Miss Carter, this is Stan Holloway, he said, glancing over at Lily, who sat curled up on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest. I have a situation. A serious one. There was a brief pause. Go on. Stan hesitated only for a second before diving in. One of your students, Lily Brooks, showed up at my house tonight. She ran away from home. She's scared, says her father has been hurting her. And she thinks something happened to her mother. Silence. When Miss Carter spoke again, her voice was quieter, but firm. Where is she now? She's here with me. She's safe, but she's terrified. Stan, you did the right thing by calling, she said immediately. I need you to keep her there. I'm going to make a call to Child Protective Services and the police. This is beyond a school issue now. Stan exhaled. Do you think they'll be able to protect her? Miss Carter's voice softened. We will do everything we can. As soon as he hung up, he turned back to Lily. They're sending help, he told her. She wiped at her eyes, sniffling. Will they believe me? Stan gave her the most reassuring look he could muster. Yes. And I believe you too. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying the scent of rain in the distance. Somewhere out there, a man with dangerous secrets was likely wondering where his daughter had gone. But inside Stan's house, for the first time in a long time, Lily wasn't alone. And she wasn't going back. The truth in the darkness. The moments after Stan ended the call with Miss Carter felt like an eternity. The weight of the night's events sat heavy on his chest as he turned back to Lily, who had curled up on the couch, gripping the blanket like it was the only thing tethering her to safety. The fear in her eyes hadn't faded, but there was something else now. Exhaustion, deep and heavy. The kind of tiredness that had nothing to do with lack of sleep and everything to do with the burden she had been carrying alone for so long. Stan exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair, trying to figure out how to make this easier for her. You don't have to be afraid anymore, Lily, he said softly, easing himself down into the armchair across from her. Help is coming. People who care about you are going to make sure you're safe. Lily's fingers twisted in the hem of the blanket. She was staring at the floor, but her mind was clearly elsewhere, lost in some internal war between hope and fear. I used to think no one would ever believe me, she murmured, voice barely above a whisper. He told me that if I ever said anything, no one would care. That no one would help me. Her voice broke on the last word, and she inhaled sharply, trying to hold herself together. Stan felt his stomach twist. He had heard stories before. News reports about children who suffered in silence, about abusive parents who convinced their victims that they were powerless, that speaking up would only make things worse. And the worst part was that, in too many cases, they were right. But not this time. I believe you, he told her firmly. And trust me, the people who are coming to help you, they'll believe you too. You don't have to carry this alone anymore. Lily swallowed, blinking away the fresh tears that had welled in her eyes. She nodded, but Stan could tell she wasn't entirely convinced yet. The house was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional creak of the old pipes. Outside, the streetlights cast long, eerie shadows through the front window. The world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable knock on the door that would change everything. Then suddenly, a noise shattered the fragile stillness. A car door slamming. Lily's breath hitched. Stan's entire body tensed. He turned his head sharply toward the window, his heartbeat thudding against his ribs. He moved quickly but quietly, crossing the room to peek through the curtain. And his blood ran cold. A black sit-in. The same one from earlier. It was parked a few houses down now, engine off, headlights dark. But Stan could see the faint outline of a figure sitting in the driver's seat, unmoving, watching. Stan felt his throat tighten. He turned back to Lily, who had curled in on herself, her entire body trembling. She didn't have to say anything. He already knew. It was him. Stan's fingers clenched into fists. He had no idea how Daniel Brooks had found them, or if he even knew Lily was here. But the fact that he was out there, lurking in the shadows, set every nerve in Stan's body on high alert. He grabbed his phone again, quickly dialing Miss Carter's number. She answered almost immediately. Miss Carter, the man Lily is afraid of. Her father. He's outside, Stan said, keeping his voice low but urgent. I don't know if he's looking for her, but he's parked a few houses down. I need the police here. Now. There was a pause on the other end, then the unmistakable shift in her tone. Calm, but serious. I understand. Stay inside. Lock your doors. The police were already being dispatched, but I'll call again and tell them it's urgent. Do not confront him. Stan, just keep Lily safe. Stan ended the call and turned to the girl. Come with me. She hesitated, but when she saw the look on his face, she obeyed. He led her down the hall to his bedroom, where he motioned for her to sit on the floor between the bed and the nightstand. Stay here, he instructed. If anything happens, don't move unless I tell you to. Lily was already shaking her head. I don't want to be alone. Stan hesitated, then crouched in front of her, his hands firm on her shoulders. I promise, you're not alone. I'm right here. But I need to be able to see what's going on. You trust me, don't you? After a moment, she gave a tiny nod. Good, he said. Now stay here, okay? He stood and returned to the living room, his mind racing through the possibilities. Would Daniel Brooks try to force his way inside? Would he wait? Did he even know Lily was here, or was this just some sick coincidence? He didn't have time to wonder. Another sound, a slow, deliberate knock at the front door. Stan's breath caught in his throat. Then a voice, deep, measured. Mr. Holloway. Stan's jaw clenched. He didn't respond. I know you're in there, the voice continued. I just want to talk. Stan took a slow step toward the door, peering through the peephole. Daniel Brooks stood on his porch, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, his expression neutral. But his eyes were sharp, calculating, like a predator sizing up his prey. Stan's fingers hovered over his phone. He could call the police back, but he knew they were already on their way. For now, all he had to do was stall. "There's nothing to talk about," he called back, making sure his voice carried the weight of authority. Daniel exhaled a quiet chuckle, tilting his head slightly. "Come on, Stan. I just want to know if you've seen my daughter." Stan's grip on the phone tightened. Daniel sighed when there was no response. "She ran off, you see," he continued. "Silly girl. Kids do that sometimes. I just want to bring her home where she belongs." Stan felt his skin crawl. Every instinct in his body screamed that this man was dangerous, that if Lily went back with him, she might never be seen again. "She's not here," Stan lied, his voice steady. "I haven't seen her." A slow smile crept across Daniel's face, but there was no warmth in it. "Well, if you do," he said, taking a step back down the porch, "tell her to come home. Before she does something she'll regret." And then he turned, walking back toward his car. Stan didn't move until he heard the engine start. He watched as the Savin pulled away, disappearing into the night, but he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As soon as the taillights faded, the distant wail of sirens filled the air. Relief flooded Stan's chest as he let out a slow breath, finally unlocking the door just as the first police cruiser pulled up to the curb. Lily was safe. For now. But Stan knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about a runaway child anymore. This was about something bigger, something darker. And he wasn't going to stop until the truth, all of it, came to light. A storm of secrets. The flashing red and blue lights painted streaks across Stan's front yard as the first squad car came to a slow stop at the curb. Stan barely had time to exhale before the doors swung open, and two officers stepped out. Their uniforms were crisp, their postures tense, eyes scanning the darkness like they expected something, or someone, to emerge. Stan opened the door before they even reached the porch. "He was here," he said without waiting for them to ask. "Daniel Brooks. He knocked on my door a few minutes ago, asking for Lily." The taller officer, a no-nonsense man with short-cropped hair, nodded sharply. "Did he threaten you?" Stan hesitated, glancing over his shoulder toward the hallway where Lily remained hidden. "Not outright," he admitted, "but he didn't have to." His tone, the way he stood there, the way he said she should come home before she does something she'll regret. It wasn't a request. The second officer, a younger woman with dark hair pulled into a tight bun, exchanged a look with her partner. "Did he see Lily?" she asked. "No," Stan assured her. "I didn't let him inside. He drove off before you got here." The officer nodded. "We'll send units to patrol the neighborhood, see if he's still lingering somewhere nearby. But Mr. Holloway, you need to know, right now, there's no official warrant for his arrest. If he hasn't been charged, we can't just detain him unless we have probable cause." Stan's frustration flared. "What about Lily? What about everything she's told me? She's terrified of that man. She thinks he hurt her mother." The taller officer nodded again, his expression grim. "We understand. CPS has already been contacted, and an emergency protective order will be filed tonight. That means Daniel Brooks won't be able to legally go near her once it's in place. But until then, our hands are tied unless we catch him in the act." Stan wanted to argue, but he knew they were right. The law moved at its own pace, and it wasn't always fast enough to protect the people who needed it most. He stepped back. "She's inside," he said, motioning toward the house. "I told her to stay in my bedroom. She's scared out of her mind." The female officer's face softened. "Would it be all right if I spoke with her?" Stan nodded. "Of course." He led the officer down the hallway, pausing outside the bedroom door before knocking gently. "Lily, it's okay. It's the police." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Stan worried she wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, the door creaked open, and Lily peeked out. Her eyes were still red-rimmed from crying, her small frame swallowed up in the oversized sweater Stan had given her earlier. The officer crouched down to her level. "Hi, Lily," she said gently. "My name is Officer Reyes. I know you're scared, but I promise we're here to help. Can I sit with you for a minute and ask you some questions?" Lily glanced up at Stan, seeking silent reassurance. He gave her a nod, and after a moment, she stepped aside, allowing Officer Reyes into the room. Stan didn't follow. He stayed just outside the door, listening as Lily began answering questions, her voice quiet, halting at first, but growing steadier as she talked. She told them about the bruises, the way her father would grab her by the arms when she didn't answer fast enough, the way his anger flared unpredictably, turning the house into a minefield she was always afraid to step wrong in. She talked about her mother, how one day she was there, and the next she was gone, how her father had told her she left, but how the story had never felt right. And then she said something that made the hair on the back of Stan's neck stand up. "I heard something," she whispered, "the night she disappeared." Officer Reyes' voice was calm, steady. "What did you hear, sweetheart?" Lily's breath shuddered. "It was late. I was in bed, but I wasn't asleep. I heard them arguing downstairs, but that wasn't new. They always argued." A pause. "But this time," she screamed. Stan closed his eyes. Lily's voice dropped to a whisper. And then, it just stopped. The room was silent. Officer Reyes was the first to speak. "Lily, did you see anything? Did you go downstairs?" Lily shook her head. "I was too scared. But in the morning, she was gone. And my dad, he cleaned everything. The floors, the counters. He said it was because she left a mess. But I think it was because of something else." Stan felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. Officer Reyes reached for her radio. "I need to call this in," she said, standing. "We're no longer looking at a missing persons case. We might be dealing with a homicide." Lily flinched at the word, but Stan immediately stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're doing the right thing," he told her, "no matter how scary it feels." She looked up at him, her small fingers clutching his sleeve. "He's not going to get away with it, is he?" Stan didn't hesitate. "No," he promised. "Not this time." The next few hours were a blur. More police arrived, crime scene investigators, detectives. They didn't have a body, but they had testimony, suspicions, and a house that now needed to be searched. Lily, in the meantime, was placed under emergency protective custody. A social worker arrived to take her to a safe house while the investigation unfolded. She clung to Stan's hand before she left, her fear palpable. "You're going to be okay," he reassured her. "You're not alone anymore." She nodded, but there was doubt in her eyes. Stan felt it too, because Daniel Brooks was still out there. And men like him didn't go down without a fight. The walls close in. The night felt longer than any Stan had lived through in his 61 years. After the police took Lily to a safe house, he was left alone in his home, surrounded by the lingering weight of everything that had transpired. The couch where she had curled up, the glass of water she had barely touched, the blanket she had clutched for warmth. Everything was a reminder of the fear she had carried with her, and the dark truth she had finally spoken aloud. Stan sat in his armchair, rubbing a hand over his face, his mind running in circles. Daniel Brooks was still out there, and now the police knew they were no longer just dealing with an abusive father. If what Lily had said was true, and Stan had no doubt that it was, then her mother hadn't left at all. She had been silenced, and her husband had cleaned up the mess. Outside, rain had begun to fall, light at first, then steadily growing heavier. It drummed against the roof, ran in rivulets down the window panes, and whispered through the trees lining the street. It was the kind of storm that made everything feel more enclosed, like the world had drawn its curtains and left him alone with his thoughts. Stan knew sleep was out of the question, so he stood and wandered to the kitchen, his mind still buzzing. He brewed a cup of coffee, out of habit more than need, then stared at it, untouched, while he debated what to do next. Then his phone rang. His heart jumped into his throat as he snatched it up. The caller ID read Detective Rowan Parker. Stan answered immediately. Detective. Stan. Parker's voice was sharp, carrying the urgency of someone who had been awake for far too long. We have a problem. Stan's fingers clenched around the phone. What kind of problem? There was a pause, as if Parker was weighing how much to say. We found something. Stan swallowed. What? Blood. The word hung in the air, cold and heavy. Parker continued. We got a search warrant for Brooks' house. The crime scene unit went through it tonight. We didn't find a body, but we did find blood traces in the kitchen. More than just a small cut or accident. Some of it had been cleaned up, but forensic teams know what to look for. A pause. We're running tests now, but given everything Lily said, we have every reason to believe it belongs to her mother. Stan exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on the phone. So that means? It means we're officially treating this as a homicide investigation, Parker confirmed. The case has shifted. This is no longer just about child abuse. We believe Daniel Brooks murdered his wife. Stan closed his eyes, the weight of the truth settling in. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. Where is he? He asked after a long pause. Have you found him? Another silence. Then, no. Stan's stomach dropped. He vanished after leaving your house, Parker admitted. We've been tracking his movements, but so far he's managed to stay one step ahead of us. No credit card activity, no known addresses. He's smart. He's using cash, staying off the grid. But he won't be able to run forever. Not with a murder investigation on his name. Stan rubbed his temple. What about Lily? Is she safe? Yes, Parker assured him. She's in protective custody. No one knows her location except for law enforcement and child services. A beat of hesitation. But we're concerned, Stan. If Brooks realizes we're onto him, he might do something reckless. He has nothing to lose now. Stan exhaled slowly, glancing toward the window. The street was dark, empty. But the unease in his gut refused to settle. You think he'll come after her? He asked quietly. We can't rule it out, Parker admitted, which is why I need to ask. Are you sure he didn't see Lily when he came to your house tonight? Stan thought back to the encounter, to the way Brooks had stood on his porch, eyes sharp and calculating. No, he said. I don't think he did, but he suspects she was here. And if he's looking for her... The words trailed off, unfinished. The implications were clear. We have officers watching all major transport stations, buses, trains, even airports, Parker said. We're also putting out an alert to nearby towns and cities. But, Stan, his voice dropped slightly, as if lowering it could make the words less heavy. If Brooks is still in town, he's going to come looking for answers. And you're the only lead he has. Stan's grip on the phone tightened. You think he'll come back here? I think he might, Parker admitted. So I need you to be careful. Lock your doors. Keep your lights on. If you see anything suspicious, call us. Do not, under any circumstances, engage with him. Stan exhaled, his mind already racing through possibilities. Understood. Good, Parker said. And Stan, yeah. A pause. You did the right thing. No matter how this ends. Stan swallowed, nodding to himself. I know. The call ended, but the tension in his chest remained. He locked the doors, checked the windows. Then he sat in his chair, staring into the dark, waiting. Hours passed, but sleep never came. Stan dozed off at some point, the rain still whispering against the glass, but he jolted awake when something outside made a sound, a noise so quiet, so subtle, that most people would have dismissed it. But not him. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. It was footsteps, moving softly, deliberately. Stan's breath caught in his throat as he sat up, listening intently. Another sound, closer this time. The creak of wood. The unmistakable sound of weight shifting on his front porch. His heartbeat thundered. Slowly, carefully, he reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over the emergency call button. And then, a shadow passed by the window, a figure barely visible in the dim light. Someone was outside. Someone was watching. Stan didn't move. He barely breathed. He tightened his grip on the phone, ready to call the police. But before he could press the button, the shadow disappeared. Gone. The footsteps faded. The silence returned. Stan sat frozen for several long moments, his pulse pounding in his ears. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he exhaled and forced himself to move. He reached for the curtains, yanked them back. The porch was empty. The street was still. But the feeling remained. Daniel Brooks was still out there. And he wasn't finished yet. The final confrontation. The hours after Stan's unsettling encounter with the shadow outside his house were among the longest he had ever endured. His nerves were stretched thin, his mind racing through every worst-case scenario he could conjure. Daniel Brooks was out there, somewhere in the dark, watching, waiting. The knowledge sat heavy in Stan's chest, like a lead weight, a constant, suffocating reminder that danger was closer than ever. He stayed awake through the remainder of the night, too wired to even consider sleep. He kept his phone in his hand, ready to call Detective Parker at the first sign of movement. But the shadow never returned, and the creeping footsteps never came again. By the time dawn broke, pale and gray against the horizon, Stan felt like he had aged a decade overnight. He didn't bother with coffee that morning. His adrenaline was enough to keep him awake. Instead, he paced the living room, mind flicking through everything he knew, trying to piece together what Daniel Brooks might do next. He had nothing to lose now. The police were after him, the evidence was stacking up against him, and he was running out of places to hide. And a man with nothing to lose was the most dangerous kind of man. Stan knew he needed to speak to Parker. By mid-morning, he finally made the call. Parker answered on the first ring. "Stan," he greeted, his voice carrying the same exhaustion that Stan felt in his bones. "Tell me you've got good news." Stan exhaled. "Not exactly. I think Brooks was outside my house last night." Silence. Then Parker's voice turned sharp. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be. I heard footsteps on the porch. Saw a shadow at the window. When I checked, he was gone." Parker cursed under his breath. "All right. That's it. We're done playing cat and mouse. I'm putting an officer on your house. He wants to lurk in the shadows. Fine. We'll be waiting for him." Stan nodded, relieved. "Good, because I don't think he's giving up." Parker's voice was tight. "I don't think so either." By late afternoon, a patrol car was stationed a few houses down from Stan's. The presence of law enforcement should have made him feel safer, but it didn't shake the gnawing sense of unease crawling up his spine. Brooks was unpredictable, and men like him didn't just disappear without a fight. As the day wore on, Stan found himself going through the motions of normal life. Cleaning, organizing, fixing things that didn't really need fixing. Anything to keep his mind occupied, but no matter how hard he tried to distract himself, the knowledge remained. Brooks was still out there. And then, just as the sun began to set, his phone rang again. It was Parker. "We found something," the detective said, his voice urgent. Stan sat up straight. "What?" "A storage unit," Parker revealed, "under a fake name. One of my officers followed a lead and found it just outside of town. We got a warrant and opened it up." Stan's stomach clenched. What was inside? There was a long pause. Then Parker spoke. "Evidence." The word was heavy with implication. "Evidence of what?" Stan pressed. Parker's voice was grimmer than Stan had ever heard it. "Of what he did to his wife." Stan inhaled sharply. "We haven't found a body yet," Parker admitted. "But we found her belongings. Clothes, personal items, and something else." Another pause. Then, the words that made Stan's blood turn ice cold. a shovel, and a tarp covered in dried blood. Stan closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. He had suspected it. He had feared it. But hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. Parker continued. Forensics is running tests now, but it's not looking good. The moment we get confirmation, we'll issue an official warrant for Brooks' arrest on murder charges. Stan swallowed the lump in his throat. And Lily? She's still safe, Parker assured him. She doesn't know yet. We'll break the news when the time is right. Stan nodded, his mind reeling. What about Brooks? Parker sighed. We're closing in. We have reason to believe he's still in town, but he's keeping low. Probably knows we're onto him. A pause. But Stan, I need you to be careful. If he knows we're closing in, he might come back. And this time, it won't just be to knock on your door. The hours passed in a blur of tension. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of crimson and gold before giving way to darkness once more. The patrol car remained outside, a quiet but constant presence. Stan tried to relax, but it was impossible. The knowledge that Brooks was still lurking somewhere out there was a weight pressing down on him. And then, a noise, a rustling sound outside. Stan's heart slammed against his ribs. He moved carefully toward the window, peeking through the curtain. His breath caught. A figure stood at the edge of his yard. Not an officer, not a neighbor. Daniel Brooks. His posture was tense, his face partially obscured by the shadows. He wasn't just standing there. He was watching, waiting. And then, as if he could sense Stan looking at him, he smiled. A slow, deliberate, chilling smile. Stan's fingers tightened around his phone. He turned away from the window, dialing Parker's number with shaking hands. The detective answered immediately. Stan. He's here, Stan whispered. Right outside. Parker's response was immediate. Stay inside. Lock your doors. Officers are on their way. Stan hung up and backed away from the window, his pulse hammering. Then, a sound. A soft, deliberate tapping against the front door. Tap, tap, tap. Stan swallowed hard, gripping his phone like a lifeline. He took a slow step toward the door, his breath shallow. Then came the voice. Low, smooth, almost conversational. Stan. Stan didn't answer. A chuckle. I know you're in there. Stan's fists clenched. Come on, Brooks coaxed. Let's talk. Stan's jaw tightened. There's nothing to talk about. A pause. Then, I think there is. Another silence. Then, without warning, the doorknob rattled. Stan's pulse spiked. He took a step back, his breathing quick and shallow. He could hear sirens in the distance now, drawing closer, but he wasn't sure they'd get here in time. Brooks' voice darkened. You should have stayed out of this, Stan. Stan took another step back. And you should have never laid a hand on your daughter. Silence. Then, a sharp bang against the door. Stan flinched, but he didn't move. He could hear the sirens now, louder, closer. Then, flashing lights, the sound of screeching tires. Shouts. Police, get down. The pounding stopped. Stan stayed frozen as chaos erupted outside. Shouts, commands, the unmistakable sound of someone being tackled to the ground. Then, finally, silence. Stan exhaled, his entire body shaking. He stepped forward, hesitated, then opened the door. Daniel Brooks was on the ground, his hands behind his back, an officer kneeling on his spine. His face was twisted in rage, his teeth bared like an animal caught in a trap. Parker stood nearby, watching with narrowed eyes. When he spotted Stan, he gave a single nod. It's over. Stan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he finally believed it.